2 months ago, my hair started falling out in clumps. This had happened to me before, 5 years ago at a hospital in London. I was there waiting for my father to die. Alarmed by the bare patches that appeared on my scalp, I consulted a doctor in another department at the hospital. He told me it was an autoimmune response provoked by the stress of my father's illness. I was prescribed a hair tonic and told not to worry. Obediently, I returned to the cancer ward, clutching free samples of the tonic, together with promotional materials from the pharmaceutical company. Later, after visiting hours had ended, and I had kissed my father goodnight, I went back to the hotel where I had been living for the past month. I went into the bathroom, sprinkled the tonic on the bare patches, and rubbed it in as directed. I sniffed my fingers, and then the bottle. The smell of the tonic was sharp and heavily perfumed, and somehow not sufficiently medicinal. I set it down, far from reassured. I remember that I examined the brochures from the pharmaceutical company, repeated the procedure, and then lay down on the hotel bed looking up autoimmune disorders on the internet. The range of symptoms and conditions thrown up by the search was diffuse and confusing, and I was briefly overwhelmed. I closed the window and lay in the dark. The first scientist to identify the condition had termed it horror autotoxicus. I recalled the words of the doctor. Essentially, the immune system has been thrown into overdrive. My body was self-cannibalizing, and I was meant to ward off this process with a bottle of scented hair tonic. But in fact, the tonic had worked. The hair had grown back in time, and I forgot about the autoimmunity and the anxiety. My father died. I returned to New York, and Kay, and my job at the fund. Life resumed in a shape only subtly different to its previous one. But now, several years later, it had all come back, the symptom and its cause, the hair loss and the dread. I woke that morning before dawn, the alarm buzzing quietly in my ear. I went into the bathroom to shower, careful not to wake Kay as he lay sleeping in the bed, his breathing shallow and regular. I stood under the water and washed my hair. Dozens of strands came away in my fingers as I scrubbed and then rinsed out the shampoo. I switched off the water and gathered the fallen strands. I dropped the clump of hair into the garbage can and then got dressed, leaving for the airport shortly after. I passed through the house, turning off the lights and locking the door behind me. It was still dark out. Behind me, the house was quiet, and for a moment I stood on the doorstep, trembling. The car was waiting in the street below. There was no traffic, and the ride to the airport was short. Soon, I was boarding the airplane and stowing my bag in the overhead compartment. I stared out the window at the expanse of asphalt, the flock of aircraft moving down the runway. Then I tugged the blind down. The previous day, I had read an article about the precipitous decline of the bird population, a decline of 30% over the past 50 years, the vanishing of some 3 billion birds in North America alone. Only a week earlier, Kay and I were walking home from dinner at a local restaurant that specialized in farm-to-table cuisine, the kind of restaurant where each ingredient came with a provenance. The restaurant was called The Sparrow. As we walked home, it occurred to me that there are no birds in sight. Not on the sidewalk, in the trees, on the telephone wires. In amidst the ambient noise of the city, I could detect the sound of cars, voices on the street, music from a nearby apartment, but no birdsong. When I was a child, I heard birds all the time. What was alarming to me was not only the silence in the street, it was the fact that I had only just noticed an absence that had been slowly yawning open over the years. Throughout my childhood, that childhood of constant birdsong, a poster from the campaign to save the California condor hung in my father's study. Years later, I could still recall the illustration, the way the artist had rendered the hulking shape of the vulture. The condor went extinct in 1987, followed by so many others, followed by a cascade, and now 3 billion birds gone. The world my father had loved was rapidly slipping away. There was something about this that was suddenly terrible, as if a final point of contact was coming loose or being otherwise eradicated. As the flight attendant passed through the aisle, I closed my eyes and tried to focus on the coming day, the task at hand. I was on my way to visit a biogenetics lab in Florida that had developed a genetically modified pine tree. The adjustment they had made was simple. The tree produced 5 times the resin of an ordinary pine. But that resin could be converted to jet fuel with minimal impact and cost, and as a result, the tree had the potential to transform the clean energy sector. Airplanes like the one I sat in could hurtle through the sky, powered by tree sap. Our fund had been tracking the lab's progress for some time. Their work had previously been financed by the Department of Energy, but under the current administration, the funding for clean energy had been cut, and the lab's progress was now floundering. I knew timing was the most critical element of our approach. The head of the lab was a geneticist renowned for his brilliance and his long-standing rejection of private equity. Now, however, he was in a position where his research was exposed, his lab endangered. And that was where I came in, at least hypothetically. I understood that I was exploiting a vulnerability. That was part of the job description. A fact that I had learned to live with and even on occasion take pleasure in. But it was also a fact that the geneticist stood to gain a great deal of money, alongside the ability to continue his research and employ his lab. Because of these factors and others, I did not think he could be indifferent to the right offer. He had, at any rate, agreed to see me after several months of evasive emails and unanswered telephone calls. This was undoubtedly progress. I only wished that I was in a better frame of mind for the meeting. Before too long, I was disembarking at a regional airport in North Florida. The humidity, as I crossed the tarmac, was like a physical assault. When I reached the terminal, I looked around hopefully for a coffee shop, but the place was empty. Reluctantly, I made my way to the taxi line, mind fuzzy with fatigue. The research lab was very close to the airport, or so the taxi driver told me. I sent a message telling the geneticist I was in a cab and would arrive shortly. The car moved through the city at a stately 20 miles an hour that made my skin crawl with impatience. As he drove, the driver explained the layout of the city, pointed out the monuments and attractions in a dogged but somehow desultory manner. Eventually, we reached a campus, passing through various barriers and gates, past guards and surveillance cameras. "Here we are," the driver said. I looked out the window. As the car approached the building, I saw a man standing out front, his hands plunged into his pockets and his expression bleak. I stepped out of the car and he came forward. As I had suspected, it was the geneticist. I held out my hand and he smiled cautiously. "Thank you for making the time to see me," I said. I saw a flicker of extreme apprehension as he took and then abruptly released my hand, as if the feel of it were too unpleasant to bear. He made a nervous gesture and suggested that we go directly to the greenhouse. As we began walking, he explained that the science was relatively complex, but somehow easier for people to grasp once they saw the specimens themselves. As he spoke, I understood that the discussion of his work put him at ease, that there was comfort in the scientific language he marshaled with such facility. A light drizzle had begun. The geneticist tugged the hood of his rain jacket over his head, then paused if I asked if I had a coat or an umbrella, his voice fretful. I told him I was fine with the rain. In the distance, I saw a row of greenhouses. "That one on the left is mine," he announced, and I could hear the pride in his voice. The rain grew heavier still, and we ran the last few yards to the entrance. The geneticist fumbled with a large padlock before he swung the door open. Inside, the sound of the rain was much louder, amplified by the plastic roofing. I looked around. The greenhouse was filled with thousands of pine trees in various stages of growth. Some sprouted out of what looked like test tubes, while others were potted in small plastic tubs, their slender trunks pushing up toward the greenhouse roof. They proliferated on row after row of tables, enormous grow lights rigged above them, a humid mist visible in the air. "Follow me," the geneticist said. As he moved down the center aisle, he seemed suddenly expansive, explaining that he had started his research after studying a beetle blight that had wiped out much of the pine tree population in Canada. I realized that if the trees could be modified to generate larger amounts of sap, the insects would be deterred by the excess resin, he continued. The same would go for a fungal blight, such as the one that wiped out the American chestnut population in the first half of the 20th century. He referred to these epidemics, the American fungal blight, the Canadian beetle blight, as if they were well-known historical events. There was an entire history I was unaware of, a parallel world. For a brief moment, I heard the scurrying of beetle legs, the scratching of elytra in my ear. I felt a wave of nausea and gripped the edge of a nearby table for support. The geneticist turned down another aisle and waited for me to join him. When I did, he pointed to the trunk of a sapling. A small gash dripped sap, like a bleeding cut. Essentially, the immune system has been thrown into overdrive. I looked at him startled. He stared back at me, his expression calm and placid. As a tree grows, he continued evenly, the flow of sap will increase further. It may not look like much, but relative to the age of the plant, the level of resin production is extraordinary. He paused. Go on, take a look for yourself. He stepped back and gestured to the tree, and reluctantly, I leaned forward to examine it. There was far more resin than I had seen at first glance. The sap had formed densely packed crystals along the surface of the trunk, and as I examined it, I felt another wave of nausea, a rush of trypophobia at the irregularly pocked surface. I heard the scratching of the beetles again and straightened abruptly. And so the experiment is a success, I said. The geneticist looked at me. It's not simply an experiment. These trees capture significantly more carbon than ordinary pine trees. There are millions of acres of pines planted in the southeastern coastal plain. If those trees were my trees, they could be tapped for resin for the duration of their growth. They could be harvested for the paper industry, and once they were harvested, further resin could be extracted from the pulp. I understand. We specialize in big picture thinking, I said mechanically. He gave a melancholy shake of the head. You do know that for anything to happen, the USDA will need to approve trees for commercial use, a process that is long and requires considerable resources. Then there are the various infrastructural issues. The tree tapping industry has completely declined. There's only one company in the southeast region that does the work. None of this is necessarily insurmountable, he conceded. I'm only trying to give you the whole picture. I'm only warning you. He gave me a sidelong and suddenly surreptitious look. I understand that you're trying to dissuade me, I said, but let me ask you a question. What is the alternative? If you accept funding, you can continue your research and work towards USDA approval and establishing chains of production. But if you continue alone, what will you do? Well, we've identified the genes that increase the production of terpene. Over time, we can breed the trees to reach these levels without using modification, but the process will take considerably longer. How much longer, I asked. Probably 18 to 20 years to reach the first round, he said, and he again gave a melancholy smile, by which point I will certainly be retired and might possibly be dead. I gave a short laugh and he suddenly sighed. After a little while, he shook his head. You're right, but this isn't easy. It's a big step and I'm no businessman. There are people at the university who can help you with that side of things, I said quickly. I paused, watching him. I understand that it's a shift. My father was an academic researcher. He faced many of the same dilemmas. In what field? Engineering. Where does he teach? He's dead. I'm sorry, he said. He seemed nonplussed and even upset. He looked around helplessly, as if seeking a way to express his concern. His eyes fell upon his trees, and I saw the idea come to him, even before he spoke. Would you like one? One. A tree. A gesture of goodwill. He paused. For the coming negotiations. My headache was suddenly more pronounced, a dull pain radiating through my skull. I looked at the tree with the gash in its side, the congealed resin opalescent against the slender trunk. I felt a shiver of unease, the same scurrying feeling of disgust. The geneticist was looking at me politely, his face expressionless. Then he slowly smiled as he pointed to the bleeding tree. What about this one?